All right, hi everyone. Thanks again for your patience. I'm Sophie, and I'm excited to talk about our work. So AR and VR, or augmented reality and virtual reality devices, are being used in some really sensitive contexts these days, like medicine, the military, and more. And further, they are projected to become the next generation of personal devices. So either way, these devices will be in the hands of users who are interacting with sensitive data, and those users will need authentication to keep that data safe. Now, passwords are obviously the most obvious option. They're the default on most other platforms. But passwords don't really work on AR and VR super well. When a user tries to authenticate using a password on AR and VR, they see this virtual keyboard floating in front of them, and they have to click with their hand or a controller by selecting individual keys. And I speak from experience, this is not a usable or accessible process by any means. And unfortunately, this poor usability also means that there's poor security by using passwords in AR and VR. For example, the slow speed of actions, as well as the observability of those actions, means users are vulnerable to shoulder surfing. Fortunately, AR and VR present some unique possibilities, some interesting inputs and outputs that could potentially allow them to help us move beyond passwords. For example, we could leverage these sensors for multi-factor authentication or biometrics. The possibilities are really exciting, and we argue that now is the right time to synthesize authentication for AR and VR so that suboptimal techniques like passwords are not set in stone. Our work does that with a non-traditional SoK. So we don't just look at academic literature, we take a more broad approach that helps to get a bigger sense of the gap between research and practice. We start with a survey of users and developers to see what their needs and wants are for AR and VR authentication. And from their comments, we distill a set of 20 evaluation criteria. We then use these criteria to evaluate the state of AR and VR authentication in current apps, as well as in methods proposed in prior work. In this way, we can get a good comprehensive sense of the state of AR and VR authentication. I'll start by talking about our survey and evaluation criteria. So for our survey, we wanted to ask two main questions. For users, which authentication methods have they used on AR and VR, and what did they think about the usability and security of those methods? For developers, we wanted to know which authentication methods they chose to use when developing apps, and what influenced those decisions. We recruited our participants from online platforms like Reddit and ended up considering responses from 139 users and 49 developers within those users. Finally, we took their comments and defined our set of evaluation criteria that reflect the needs and wants of users and developers. We identified 20 properties for evaluation, which fell into 4 main categories in no particular order: deployability, usability, accessibility, and security. I'm not going to go into all of these in detail, but when you scan over these properties, you may notice that there is some overlap with prior work. For example, notably, Know-It-All's quest to replace passwords was inspirational to us. But the difference between our work and prior work is that our work specifically notes the unique challenges of AR and VR. For example, since these devices are moving towards standalone, authentication for AR and VR will need to be low power consumption, since these are already power-constrained devices. They will need to not require the user to have a secondary device, and they will need to be acceptable for users who want to authenticate in public. Again, this is just a taste of the properties we came up with. Please see the paper for more details. So now that we have our evaluation criteria, we're going to use that to evaluate the state of AR and VR authentication currently used in apps. And later we'll compare that to methods proposed in practice. To evaluate the state of current AR and VR auth, we looked at 2 devices, the HoloLens 2, an AR device that is standalone, and the HTC Vive, a PC-tethered VR device. For each device, we investigated the authentication methods used in apps, as well as the authentication method used when the user first puts the headset on. Over 178 apps, we identified 7 unique authentication methods in use, and we evaluated each of these methods on the properties I talked about before. The most popular method we found, or the type of method, is knowledge-based methods, by far. So this was passwords, PINs, and paired accounts. So for example, logging in with the user's Microsoft username and password. And in fact, these were so popular that of the 78 apps that used authentication, 72% of them only offered a password or a paired account. So we hypothesized that this popularity may be due to their great deployability. In our survey, users valued methods that can be used across platforms, which is certainly something that these can do. But unfortunately, as I talked about before, these methods have very poor usability and accessibility on AR and VR, and as a result, the security is also bad. So let's instead look to some possibly better methods on AR and VR, token-based methods. We identified 2 token-based methods, QR codes, and a short code, which is where a short code appears on the headset and the user enters that code on another device. These have a bit better security than the methods I talked about before due to their one-time nature. And also, they have better usability. The user doesn't have to enter something on the cumbersome virtual keyboard. They can instead just look at a QR code, for example. Unfortunately, these methods have the caveat that they also require a secondary device, which, if these devices are going to be standalone, the requirement of a secondary phone or laptop is not going to align with the future direction of AR and VR. So these are the 2 most promising methods that we found. Iris scan and something called an automatic paired account, which is a little bit different than the regular paired account I talked about earlier. So I'm going to go through an example that we saw in some HTC Vive apps. So the user first logs into their Viveport account to use the headset, and that's done on the PC. And once they put the headset on, they can now access their library of apps. If they open an app which uses automatic paired account, they are automatically authenticated to that Viveport account without having to re-enter a username or password. And that means that automatic paired account is extremely usable. And it, plus Iris Scan, which we know and love, are the most promising methods we identified. As I said, these have great usability and accessibility. Beyond the initial login, automatic paired account does not require the user to do anything. And Iris Scan is, of course, effortless as well. They both have strong security by removing the observable actions of passwords. And additionally, Iris Scan is very accurate, at least Microsoft's implementation. For deployability, they differ a bit. Automatic paired account is as deployable as a regular paired account, which is very deployable. But Iris Scan is, of course, not available on all devices, and not even all AR and VR devices, so that may hinder its use in the future. And additionally, both have some potential privacy issues. For automatic paired account, there is a possibility that one device manufacturer could learn about all the accounts a user has on their device. And for Iris Scan, of course, there's the use of biometric data. But all in all, these are some very promising methods, and I think are a good direction to look for in the future. All right, so we've talked about the state of authentication in current apps. Let's now turn to authentication for AR/VR proposed in prior work. To evaluate proposed methods, we first queried Google Scholar for papers that presented new authentication methods specifically for AR and VR. And this was kind of a specific search, so we didn't come up with a ton at first. And we crawled the references of the papers we found to identify more relevant work. We ended up finding 38 papers, which presented 43 mechanisms in total, which is a lot more than the 7 we identified in practice. We evaluated each of these 43 methods and used the reported results in each paper to do the evaluation. Once again, knowledge-based methods were the most popular, and I have some examples up on the slide. They fell into 2 main categories, though within those categories they were very varied. Numeric pins and graphical pins. So for example, number 1 by Chang et al. Is a numeric pin, where the user speaks the red digits that correspond with the white digits of their pin. And all in all, these have good deployability. Just like the incumbents, a lot of them are already supported by the OS, a lot of them can be used on all platforms, or most platforms. And they also have some improved security over the incumbent methods. For example, the use of obfuscation, like in number 1, can help prevent that shoulder surfing issue, or the use of gaze to enter stuff instead of using observable actions can also prevent shoulder surfing. Additionally, these changes can help to improve usability, but the usability of these methods is still not great because the user has to enter a secret. And that brings me to the proposed biometrics. We saw many very interesting biometrics in our analysis, and they fell into two categories once again: physical biometrics, which measure the inherent shape of the user's body, and behavioral biometrics, which measure their characteristic movements or behavior. And what was great about these methods, specifically the physical biometrics, is that they are very usable and accessible. The physical biometrics we saw require almost no user effort at all. For example, number 5, the sound conduction method called skull conduct measures the characteristic frequency response of sound through the user's skull. And the user doesn't have to do anything while that's happening. Unfortunately, though usability is one of the main draws of biometrics, the behavioral biometrics didn't quite get that benefit as much. And the reason for that is that they require the active movement, the behaviors that make it a behavioral biometric. And those can be moving virtual balls from a bin to a tower, or walking. But either way, the requirement of these active movements reduces the usability of these methods. Further, biometrics as a whole are not quite deployable. They are definitely not supported by the OS yet, and you really can't use a lot of these methods on other platforms. Further, a lot of these are quite in their early stages. The accuracy proves that these are valid methods of authentication, but there are still false positives and false negatives that harm security as well as usability. But overall, I really think that biometrics are a very interesting direction we need to move forward in for AR and VR. And finally, we saw 3 multi-factor methods. So these provided a knowledge-based method in conjunction with a biometric. And what was great about the multi-factor methods is that they had the best security in our analysis. If someone needs to break into an app that uses a multi-factor method, they need to guess the secret, and then they need to spoof the biometric. So this layered approach is great for security. And additionally, these are some of the only methods that could say they were quasi-platform agnostic. For example, this number 9 is a Rubik's Cube pin, where they also measure the biometrics of the controller while you're entering the pin. And on other platforms, this could just be flattened to be a pin, right? However, of course, this would reduce the security a bit, as a pin is not really resilient to guessing on its own. But overall, being platform agnostic is really important to developers, as we saw in our survey. So this benefit, I think, is something that makes us really consider multi-factor methods in the future. I will leave you with some future directions. So first of all, I've said this a bunch of times in the talk, we need to focus on deployability. Getting these methods in the hands of developers will help us get them in the hands of users, so deployability is of the utmost importance. Further, we need to strengthen these biometrics. There are so many exciting options that we saw in our analysis, but in order for them to get used, we need to strengthen their accuracy, consider the privacy implications, and provide platform support. Further, we need to consider this automatic paired account option, this federated login. It provided seamless authentication for users, but we didn't see it on the other device we analyzed, the HoloLens 2. So we need to look at why this is not more widely used and what the drawbacks might be. And finally, in the meantime, while we move towards more usable methods, let's try and make password managers more available to users on AR and VR to reduce their burden in the meantime. In summary, we created evaluation properties for AR and VR authentication and used them to evaluate the state of current AR and VR apps, the authentication in current AR and VR apps, as well as proposed methods. My contact information is on the slide, so please feel free to talk to me with any questions. And thank you.
Hi, I'm Dan Bailey. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much for it. I had a question about the automatic paired account. Mm-hmm. How do you see those working with wireless devices?
Could you elaborate a little bit more? Sorry.
Well, I can see that if you are using an HTC Vive and it plugs straight into your computer, yes, that all you need to do is log in to your computer, and now you have a trusted USB connection off to the Vive. But that's not always the case with wireless devices.
Yeah, that's a great question. So A lot of these devices, whether they're tethered or not, require the user to sign into an account in order to use the device. So for example, the HoloLens 2, you sign into your Microsoft account. So theoretically, that Microsoft account would just get leveraged instead of the Vive port account, which is used on the HTC Vive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, so with the physical and biometrical evaluation methods, did you notice any privacy issues such as fingerprinting that could be employed with those?
No, we didn't. We more considered privacy as just a general issue, like the fact that a method uses biometrics at all. So we didn't really get into that. But thank you for asking.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe we can take one final question. Yeah.
Hey, Kurt Thomas, Google. I was wondering, when we talk about AR/VR space, how do you think about recovery or even shareability, which are all great things we have with passwords right now?
Shareability, like having shared devices.
More the ability to say, like, I can share my passwords with anybody. There's not like a notion that it's intrinsically tied to me like a biometric would be.
Ah, I see. Yeah, we didn't really look into that in our analysis at all, and I know we're running out of time, so do you want to grab me after and we can talk about
Happy
this?
to.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's thank Sophie again for the interesting talk.